Energy Media readers, today we're going to be talking about a favorite topic of mine, which is what do you do with bitumen in a post-oil world, or as the folks in Alberta call it, the bitumen beyond combustion. And to talk about that, we're going to chat with Sara Hastings-Simon, who's a professor at the University of Calgary and a frequent interviewee of Energy Media. So welcome to the interview, Sara.
Thanks for having me.
Now, you've been doing some research around what Premier Peter Lougheed did in the 70s and 80s to stimulate innovation in the oil industry. And we'll get to that in just a minute, but that's good context. What kind of bitumen beyond combustion projects are we talking about?
Well, there's a really broad range of things. And so not to be, not a totally exhaustive list, but some of the exciting stuff that's going on. So, looking at producing carbon nanomaterials, the idea of producing hydrogen directly out of the resource, but leaving the carbon in the ground. So, producing energy directly, but leaving the carbon behind. And then I think you can really stretch that definition even a bit further and say, what is in that resource other than the hydrocarbons? And that's where you start to get into things like lithium that may be in some of the brine, and so other metals and minerals that are in that resource that are going to play an important role in the energy systems going forward.
Right, and this is particularly germane because the peak oil demand forecasts keep getting shorter and shorter. We used to be 2040, 2050. Now we're hearing 2030, mid-2020s. So we need to start thinking now about what we're going to do with bitumen once we stop burning a lot of oil for fuel. So in the 70s and 80s, Peter Lougheed did some interesting things around innovation. Maybe can you give us a bit of an overview of that?
Yeah, so briefly, he basically set a challenge to be able to produce commercially from the in situ resources that Alberta had. So those resources were there, people knew about them, but there was a lot of doubt about the ability to produce, in a commercial way, those resources. And so he set this overarching goal of producing that resource and, put a lot of funding behind that into innovation that ultimately, led to the technology, led to SAGD, which was then taken up by industry and sort of turned into the industry that, we know today.
So are you suggesting, and you've written an op-ed in the CBC website about this, but are you suggesting that the current government under Premier Jason Kenney should do something similar with bitumen beyond combustion?
Yeah, I think with innovation broadly, so the recognition that government has an important role to play in innovation and in addressing market barriers, and this is really kind of well understood. And if you look at history of economic development, there is an important role for, sometimes also called industrial policy. But it's really important to get it right, and so you're always walking this fine line of you want to be using the competitive advantage and the resources and skills that you have as a jurisdiction, as a province in this case, but at the same time you don't want to end up in an economist term sort of captured by having that research funding captured by the industry, right? And so being close enough that you're informed by the challenges and informed by the capabilities, but then at the same time being independent enough that you're really going after not the maybe 5-year or immediate business problems, but these longer term challenges. And that's where bitumen beyond combustion, things like production of these metals and minerals and hydrogen, those I think all fit into that category where you're going to need some government support to move that along, and that can be both provincial and federal. But without that, then you're kind of not going to see those industries develop.
Now, some of this has started. It's already a number of years old, but I know I've interviewed John Zhao from Alberta Innovates, and he talks often about bitumen beyond combustion. So that we've already got a start on it, and so I guess you would argue that we need to do much more and accelerate the R&D and accelerate commercialization.
Yeah, and it's great that we've been doing all of that work, via Alberta Innovates, some by Emissions Reduction Alberta, but we need to take that stuff out of the lab, get it into the pilot scale and get it into real commercial scale pilots, it's only at that stage, is it really ready to be picked up by industry and grown in a significant way. And that takes, a lot of funding and a lot of capital, especially when you're talking about these big projects. And that's something, that's one of those critical roles for government. And that was the role that, Lougheed's government played when we look at SAG-D in really proving that out. But it required them, taking that step further beyond, the more kind of immediate concerns that industry at that time, conventional industry, would have had.
We'll wrap up the interview with this final point, Sara, but it seems to me that what I know of the other heavy crude oil producers in the world, because that's who we're talking about competing with, and so we're talking Venezuela, Mexico, Colombia, Ecuador, Brazil, and so on. They really focus just on producing, and they actually don't do a lot even on decarbonization. And in your opinion, if we start now at looking at bitumen beyond combustion and really accelerate that, does that give Alberta, it could give Alberta a significant competitive advantage, say 10, 20, 30 years down the road?
Yeah, I think a huge one, and that's the right time frame, right? And this is I heard a statement recently that I really liked. I think it describes what Alberta needs to do, which is perform while we reform. Right, so we do need, the revenue and the economic activity that's coming in from the oil sands that we have today. The point is not to stop that, but it is then to take that wealth and redirect it into growing those new economy or new areas of the economy, so that in that 10, 15, 20 years, we're ready to take the step to the next thing. And the good thing is that I think that the world is ready for that, and investors are ready for that and looking for opportunities. And so we have, I think, a very compelling case to make to, be a provider of lithium for the world going forwards, for example. But it's going to require a shift in that direction. That is, in a sense, similar to, what we did back in the 70s, where we were taking the revenues from the conventional industry and redirecting them into developing this new industry that we have today. And, if we're successful, maybe 30 years from now, somebody will be having a conversation talking about, this history and how we don't see that big difference in our industry anymore, but that there was a time when other products from the bitumen resource were looked at as very differently.
Sara, thank you very much for this. And I want to point out to our readers that a lot of this research and innovation that goes on in the industry is terrible about telling its story. And since you've moved over from Pembina last year, I noticed you've been making a really big effort at doing more of this storytelling, getting that, and of course, given your position and your academic standing, I think you're the perfect person to do this. We'll want to have you back again for more interviews to talk about this, because I think this is one of the key elements going forward for the Alberta economy and the oil and gas sector.
Thanks. Well, yeah, I'm always happy to talk about innovation, and I think it's really just critical for the province and for the country that we get this stuff right.
Sara, thank you very much. We'll talk to you again in the near future.